Welcome, everyone. My name is Emma Gildescame. I coordinate this National 303D Tmdl webinar series for NUAPIC, and I am so glad to have so many of you on the call today. I have a couple of announcements before we dive into the main event and introduce our presenters. First of all, NUAPIC is a regional commission that helps the states of the Northeast preserve and advance water quality. With support from EPA, we've been running this webinar series since 2016 as part of our work to develop, coordinate, and conduct training programs that serve water quality professionals like you, regionally and nationwide. As always, presentations in this series represent the views of the speaker and don't necessarily reflect NUAPIC or EPA endorsements or any of that. By now, a lot of you probably have spent more of your lives than you'd like to think about in GoToWebinar and similar platforms over the last year or so. But just as a refresher, everyone is muted by default. But that doesn't mean that we don't want to hear from you. There's a couple different ways to interact with us. The first is by sending a question. So throughout the webinar, please use this chat function to send a question. We will have a moderated Q&A at the very end of the presentation. So send questions throughout, and we will ask as many as we have time for at the end. If you're having trouble hearing, we do have two options for audio. So you can use your computer speakers. You can also call in by phone. Just toggle that button and it'll give you all of the call-in information you need. If you're having some issues, calling in by phone can be a lot easier if your internet connection is not the strongest. If you are still having issues, please ask for help and we'll do our best to answer them. After the webinar, we will kind of have a short survey pop up. It'll also be in the email you receive after the webinar with the recording. It's just a short survey, and the biggest question is, what webinars do you want in the future? And this webinar is a result of those. Lots of other webinars that we've had in this series are the direct result of people saying, hey, we want to hear about this issue in these post-webinar surveys. So please, please, please fill those out. We really appreciate your thoughtful input. We read all of them. Another way to help shape the future of the webinar series is by proposing a webinar. These can be really informal. We just want to see what your idea is and that you've thought through it a little bit. And I'm really happy to work through these with you. And if you have the germ of an idea that you think would be really useful, a topic that you think state and EPA folks working on 303D and Tmdl programs around the country in any part of the country would want to hear about, let me know. We have some priority topics. These have to do with any piece of the 303D program, from prioritization, implementation, anything in between. We do have some funding available, especially if you are not a government entity and want to present. So we have rolling applications, we review them, just reach out to me and we can talk about it more. We have been doing these for a long time, which means that we have a lot of webinars that we can, we have a lot of webinars that are back in our archives. I highly encourage you to check those all out. We also have a YouTube channel that is linked from the website. I'm going to pass over the controls now while I introduce our presenters. So if you bear with me for just a moment, I'm going to hand things over. Oh, come on, computer. So while Chet's getting set up, we want to get an idea of who's in the room. So I'm going to launch this poll, basically finding out all the different people that we have on the call today. If you don't see the poll, toggle on your screen, full screen or not full screen, depending on your platform. This might make it easier. While you're filling that out, I'm going to introduce our presenters. So we will hear from Chet Arnold today. He's the director of UConn's Center for Land Use Education and Research, also known as CLEAR. He's been with the university since 1987 and has worked on the Long Island Sound Studies Public Outreach Program, Nonpoint Education for Municipal Officials, the NEMO program, the National NEMO Network, and CLEAR, all of which he helped create. David Dickson is a faculty member of CLEAR and the Associate Extension Educator for the Department of the Extension of the College of Agriculture, Health, and Natural Resources. As the co-director of the NEMO program at CLEAR, he works primarily on municipal stormwater management and low-impact development issues, but also provides outreach and training focused on mobile mapping technologies, and as a member of CLEAR's geospatial training program. Last but not least, Michael Dietz is NEMO's program co-director along with David. He contributes to Sea Grant's Sustainable Coastal Community Development Program and focuses also on stormwater and low impact development. So I'm going to close the poll and hopefully we can see it's really, we have about 85% today, folks from state and federal government, about 10% from municipal and regional government, very light on academia, so our presenters will hold down the academia front, and then a handful of folks from consulting and nonprofit. So it's good to have you all here. And now, without any further ado, Chet, take it away.
Thank you, Emma. Can everybody, can you guys hear me? See my screen? Emma, are you good? We can.
You're good, Chet.
Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
Well, we got a lot of ground to cover, so let me just start off with a disclaimer for those of you that might have been brought here under false pretenses. This was a title, Solving Impervious Cover Impairments, NEWIPIC, our friends at NEWIPIC, and thanks to NEWIPIC again, came up with. And we let them get away with it somehow. We let it slip by, but we're thinking maybe something that's just a little bit more realistic, maybe, or just this, we need the stars to align and the ducks to be in order, but we are going to go through quite a few things for you today. So here's the agenda. I'm sorry, I got a cat and a dog bothering me right now if I sound flustered. I'm going to give you a little background, a couple more slides, and then we're going to try to get through very short briefs on 5 of our projects, and then still have time for Q&A. So one introduction to our center, as Emma said, we're the Center for Land Use Education and Research at UConn. We have 4 main program areas, and we're gonna, they slop over into each other quite a bit. And for instance, geospatial technology kind of infuses all of our projects. We're gonna be talking mainly about our water projects, and actually our water projects, we call the NEMO project, really predated the center by about 10 years. It's been going on since the early 90s. And Dave and Mike are still keeping that tradition alive in Connecticut. So one other introductory slide, and that is, you know, most of you are from New England. You know that there's not strong county government in New England. So in Connecticut, we haven't had regional government really since the 1950s, at least at county-wise. So we have a very strong home rule state. We don't really have a planning office. We have an Office of Policy and Management that does some statewide planning. We're one of only 5 states in the entire union that does not have a GIS center, although there's a bill in the legislature to fix that this session. We'll see how that goes. And similarly, we don't have any mandatory training for local land use officials, although again, there's a bill before the legislature this session. So in order to try to help these poor folks out on their local planning and zoning and all the things that they do and all the decisions that they make related to water quality and to non-point source pollution and to stormwater, we try to mix in a little bit of a number of different techniques, and that's what we're going to be throwing against the wall for you today. And all the projects we're going to talk about today and a lot more that we're not going to talk about there's a lot more information at our website at clear.uconn.edu. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike, who's going to talk about our impervious cover TMDL and other things going on campus.
Great, thank you, Chet. So good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here, and I look forward to having some good discussion afterwards. So I'd just like to set the stage for this a little bit to talk about the impervious cover TMDL that has been going on here for Eagleville Brook by going back to actually when I was in graduate school here at UConn. So back starting in 1999, I had several professors who had been working for years to try to get the university to address some stormwater issues here. You know, stormwater is not a new problem. It wasn't a new problem in the late 1990s, but the university was kind of slow to respond and do anything about it. So the fruits of their effort are the first bioretention that got installed on campus back in 2003, and I'll show you that in a second. But what I'd just like to give you just a very brief background on is the development of the Tmdl here for impervious cover. So there was a growing data set. Many of you, I'm sure, are aware of this research that had been going on for many years, looking at the impact of the percentage impervious cover in a watershed and the quality of the aquatic life, or the quality of those waters that drain those watersheds. And much of this research was summarized very nicely by Tom Schuler and the Center for Watershed Protection in the 1990s, and had really a nice national data set was being built. And then here in Connecticut, Chris Bellucci and some of his colleagues at Connecticut DEP did some research locally looking at the amount of impervious cover in some of our smaller watersheds around the state, and the macroinvertebrate multimetric index, and also confirmed those same findings that had been found on the national level for lots of different research and different indicators, found that to hold true here for the state as well. So when Eagleville Brook was impaired and was found to be impaired, the next step was to develop a Tmdl for that water body. And so that's the watershed of Eagleville Brook on the right that you can see. And all the red and orange in there is impervious cover. So the folks at DEP and others at EPA as well realized that the evidence was pretty clear that impervious cover was a strong indicator of degraded water quality. And so they decided to take a big plunge and use impervious cover as a surrogate pollutant for this Tmdl for Eagleville Brook. Next slide, Chet. So in 2007, that Tmdl was released. Shortly after that, Chet and mostly Chet was working on it at that point in time. Dave was doing our national NEMO network. But Chet and John Rosem were working with the university, and they were able to get some money from the university and paired that with some Section 319 funding from Connecticut DEP, and basically got that project started. So began to work with an outside consultant. This was Horsley Witten, and basically went through and evaluated this watershed of Eagleville Brook, looked at opportunities to do retrofits and reduce the amount of directly connected impervious cover. So that was a tech report that was put out in 2010. And then we further went on to develop a watershed management plan in 2011, taking into account those things that have been done to date. But the one thing I just wanted to say here is that really the university, excuse me, wasn't waiting for the results or the recommendation from this watershed management plan to get started. So implementation was really taking place all along this time frame. And it started out fairly slow, but it did ramp up pretty quickly, which I'll show you in a second. Next slide, Chet. So again, here was that first bioretention that went in 2003 that I mentioned. So again, this was way before the Tmdl. And then there was kind of a lull in implementation on campus until we get to the next slide. So now after the Tmdl was implemented, there was a lot of interest on campus. So we had a rapid fire of projects that were installed. So this is a nice pervious asphalt lot that went in 2009. There was also a sister pervious concrete lot that went in. Next slide, Chet. 2011, we had a large building that was redone on campus, and all the stormwater infrastructure or stormwater management around that building was done with LID. There's a large bioretention at McHugh Hall. Next slide. Also around McHugh Hall, the walkways were constructed of PICPs, or permeable interlocking concrete pavers. Next slide. And then 2012, another big building that got done, more bioretention going in. Next slide. More PICPs in the large walkway and plaza underneath that building. Next slide. And then along one of our main thoroughfares through campus, there's a large building here that they play some sort of sport in. If there are any sports questions, I'll have you direct those to Chet or Dave after. I'm well known as the sports idiot in the office. They do play something there though. But what I'm more interested in are these PICPs that are in the snow shelf. between the sidewalk and the road. So this was a large project, started out as a small implementation to test it out. Basically, these historically were planted with grass, and they would get really beat up from all the foot traffic that would walk across there, and they'd have to replant it almost every year. So they decided to take out the grass and put in these PICPs, and all of a sudden what you would think is a hardscape is now infiltrating water and working much better as a stormwater management practice than the grass did on that site. Next slide. So we started to get to the point where we had quite a few of these practices appearing around us on campus. It wasn't just one here or there anymore. When you look at it from above and take a big picture view, there started to be quite a few points on the map. So we decided to do a virtual tour. So we had some of the data that we had gathered from these sites and how they were performing. We filmed a few short video clips out in the field to highlight key features. And then Dave put it in a nice format of a story map here, so you can scroll through and see information about each of those sites as you click on them on the map, or you can scroll through on the left. So I'm not going to go to that now, but you can copy that link down if you'd like it. Next slide. So over the many years since the implementation has started, again, as these things grew, I got more and more requests for people. So starting from students to larger groups, other professional organizations, conferences, and then even our state congressman, Joe Courtney, became very interested in these. So we invited him to come to campus, and he came. And it's one of the few occasions that you're going to see Dave and I in a tie there, each of us. But it was a really nice day. He was very interested, and it was really cool to have him on campus. But we've brought thousands of people through campus here. It's become a national showcase because of all the implementation that we have in place. Next slide. Also, as things grew around campus, we realized that there was a need to have some information out there. We have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people every year walking past these things. And without some sort of educational signage, you're losing an opportunity to teach them about it. So as part of a 319 grant from DEP, we installed signage at some key points around campus. And you can see that here on one of our green roofs. Also, as time progressed, we came to realize that although it's very exciting to have these things be put in, that's what gets all the attention and the fanfare, the very unsexy job of maintaining them and keeping them working well came to the forefront. So as many of you are aware, if you neglect maintenance on anything, whether that's your teeth, your vehicle, or pervious pavements, you're going to pay the price in the long run. So that's part of what I started to do as part of my job, is to basically keep track of what the status was of each of our installations around campus, and then work with facilities here to either contract out to clean these pavements or do some of the work ourselves. So next slide, Chet. So I was able to involve some students in this and do some infiltration testing to see how the pavement was performing before the maintenance. Next slide. And then after maintenance. So here's a before and after. You can see how much of that sediment gets cleaned out, and we can then see how well those pavements are performing afterwards. So this maintenance was contracted out because UConn did not have the equipment to do that work at the time. That has changed now. But some of the other work we involve students with as well. So next slide, Chet. So here, again, was that first fire retention installation. This was a photo from 2004. And after 10 years, next, advance that, Chet, we found that there was a lot of erosion that had taken place here, a lot of foot traffic going through that garden, and basically preventing it from functioning at all. So we worked with a group of high school students that was here on a summer field experience, a natural resources field experience in the Conservation Ambassador Program, and put them to work and fix the maintenance, or fix the erosion problem, put some stone in there as a stone channel, and removed all the invasives from that garden. So if, we were basically just taking this into our own hands and getting it done. Next slide, Chet. So again, as time went on, I became aware of, this is starting to be quite a cumulative impact that we have from all these practices installed here. So I began to track this, the dates that these practices were installed, the square footage of impervious area. So we have a running total now of square feet of area treated with LID practices on campus. Next slide, Chet. And I also created spreadsheets for each of the individual practices with all those key data points about each installation and brought in real daily precipitation values so that I could then track the amount of stormwater that each of those practices was treating on an ongoing basis using real precipitation data. Advance that, Chet. One more slide to or advancement. So basically then I can pull from each of those individual sheets and summarize it in a total summarize or a summary spreadsheet here so that on a rolling basis, I can tell how many gallons of stormwater we've treated with all of our practices to date. So it's a bit of a pain. It's something we've got to fix is how clunky it is to update this. So I'm a bit out of date. This was about a year ago that I had updated this. So as of a year ago, this was over 54 million gallons treated to date. So when I was preparing for this presentation today, that struck me kind of as something that I had remembered from childhood. So next slide, Chet. So if you're old enough to remember this, the old days when McDonald's used to have on their sign how many billions of burgers they had served, they used to update those numbers, but then they got tired of doing that and it just became billions and billions served. So what we now have at UConn is millions and millions of gallons of stormwater treated. Next slide. So as many of you also are aware, Connecticut is now has some updated municipal separate storm sewer system or MS4 regulations, and UConn is now subject to that regulation as an institution. So all the things that go along with that, stormwater plans, monitoring, annual reporting, tracking of impervious cover, additions and subtractions are now required in the state of Connecticut here. Next slide. So for many folks that were new to this, and the impervious cover stuff was new for everybody in the state of Connecticut, it was pretty easy for us here at UConn because we had been doing it for the ICTMDL. So I had all that data in the spreadsheet already. We just created a newer, updated template for our municipalities to use, and Dave's going to talk more about what we're doing for folks in the state, MS4 permittees. But we created a template for people to use, municipalities to use, to help them keep track of these disconnections on their own. So basically, I just imported all the information, and then that can be summarized from those totals that you see, the percent disconnected on an annual or ongoing basis. And then that gets put into the annual report. Next slide, Chet. Where this is just the format that's in the report that we have to report out in. So that red rectangle that's down there, the DCIA disconnected, those numbers just come directly from our spreadsheets that track those additions and subtractions. Next slide. And that's it for me. So we will now, that's a segue to Dave for MS4.
Great. Thanks, Mike. And thanks for the invitation from Emma and from NUIPIC to talk about our stuff here. And so Mike talked a little bit about the Ms4 permit, and I wanted to give you a little bit more background on it because it's really a major shift for us here in Connecticut and has really taken a new focus on what communities have to do in terms of stormwater management. So our current permit became effective in 2017. Affects 121 of our 169 towns, plus as Mike had indicated, it also includes state and federal institutions. So like UConn is included, a couple of UConn's campuses are included in that, as well as some state institutions as well, depending on how many buildings you have on your campus and how many people sort of use that campus on a daily basis. And so this new permit is a big change from the old one. It's much more detailed than the old permit was. It's much more prescriptive than the old permit was. But the real big change, and for our purposes today, is a new heavy focus on the use of low impact development and reducing directly connected impervious area. Next slide, Chet. And so really it's a switch from, Connecticut for years and years and years, our program, the NEMO program, as well as DEEP, and others in the state have been sort of using the carrot approach to encourage the use of low impact development. And so now we're starting to move into a little bit more of a stick approach, not a very heavy stick, it's a very light one, but still sort of pushing communities to sort of pushing these practices a little bit more effectively. I'm going to tell you what those things are. Go ahead, Chet. So just a couple of the things is within the permit, there's the towns are supposed to focus the majority of their efforts on what are called priority areas. And these are sort of 3 different areas. They are the urbanized area, of course, which is, I assume in most states, MS4 permits. Any area that discharges to a stormwater impaired water body is a priority area. And then they added in the area of if there's an area that has directly connected impervious area of greater than 11%, then that is also a priority area. And that means that the majority of your efforts for your municipality or your institution have to focus on those priority areas. It also allows towns to sort of focus their meager resources on those areas that are most likely to be impacting our streams. Next slide. And so I'm just going to run through a few of the requirements really quickly of what towns have to do. And so one of the things they have to do is they have to go through their land use regulations and remove any barriers that may exist in there to the use of low impact development practices. So that's sort of a new step. And next slide. And then beyond removing any barriers, they now have to start pretty much requiring sort of that you keep stormwater on site through the use of low impact development and other practices. And so they have to, all of the MS4 permittees have to pass new regulations that require that sites that are greater than ½ an acre that are either being developed or redeveloped retain either the first 1 inch on site or depending on how much directly connected impervious area is currently on the site, a ½ an inch of the first ½ inch on site. Next slide. In addition, they have to put in the regulations that a developer or contractor has to consider the use of low impact development practices first before considering sort of more traditional stormwater management practices. So again, getting the municipalities to really see this as the sort of first line of defense in terms of dealing with stormwater management wherever it's possible. Next slide. And so then, beyond just their regulations, the towns actually have to look at what they have for existing impervious cover and start disconnecting it. And so town-wide, they have to calculate how much impervious cover they have, how much of that is directly connected to their stormwater system, and then to develop a plan for reducing their sort of directly connected impervious area by 2% by 2022, June of 2022. So just over a year away now. The towns have to develop a plan to sort of to bring that number down. And then beyond the permit term, at least until we get a new permit in the state, they have to continue to reduce that DCIA by 1% per year after that. And of course, this is subject to doing your best to implement that plan to the maximum extent practicable. Also, for those towns who had already been doing this stuff all along, or at least for the past few years, they can take credit for anything that they had put in place in terms of disconnecting impervious area looking back to 2012. And then as they go forward, as Mike was talking about on campus, how we're tracking, all of the new impervious cover we're adding and wherever we're, taking away, and sort of have a impervious cover budget that we're keeping track of. The towns have to do that now. And so as Mike suggested, we have a spreadsheet that we've offered them that we use that they can now use to do the same thing. Next slide. And so if you are a fan of low impact development or green stormwater infrastructure, you're like, woohoo, way to go deep, way to go Connecticut. You're really pushing the envelope here. You're really pushing things forward. And so you're pretty excited about this permit. But if you're a municipality who has to implement all these changes and figure out their, what impervious cover is connected and what's not, and then start reducing it by, 1% per year, it's, not quite as exciting. So one of the things that DEEP did is they came to us, and we had been partnering, for years with the NEMO program on sort of helping communities with stormwater management issues and land use issues. And so they came to us and they said, can we fund you to sort of provide some support to the communities to sort of make some of this stuff a little bit easier? And so we did that and developed an MS4 outreach program that we coordinate. The cornerstone of that program is Amanda Ryan, who is our dedicated MS4 educator. She can sort of recite the entire 88-page permit to you if you like. But she's available to go out and to meet with any communities that are having trouble with different parts of the permit and help them work through those issues. She can actually do the work for them. She's not like a contractor or something like that, but she does provide resources, helps them to interpret the permit, which can be a challenge at times, as well as, talk about what other towns have done or other communities have done to respond to the permit. And then the other big piece of it is that we have a website that has all of the 6 minimum control measures and a variety of other resources. We've been doing workshops over the past 4 years and webinars every single year. We videotape all of those and we put all of that on the website. So for each of the minimum control measures, you can click on that minimum control measure and you can find a variety of tools, templates, webinars, and workshops that we've done to sort of help communities meet those different requirements. And you can check out the website there. It's at the URL there for the website is at the bottom of the page. Next slide. Okay, and so just talking about some of the resources that respond directly to the sort of impervious cover portions, LID portions of the permit. I mean, there's a lot of other things that we're doing as well, but I just wanted to focus on those to sort of stay with the theme of today's talk. And so around 2016, we conducted a study that we call our State of LID study, where we looked at 85 of our 169 towns, and we looked at their land use regulations. And what we did is, next slide, Chet, is we went through the regulations and compared it to a list of 14 different practices. Low impact development, sometimes you can pass, like a low impact development ordinance that sort of applies to all of your other land use regulations. But a lot of times what you have to do is you have to go through sort of line by line and find out where LID isn't being allowed in different parts of your permit. So we had these 14 categories of things, from street width to parking lot runoff to setbacks and frontages, a variety of things that we were looking for that sort of allow for or discourage the use of low impact development. And so with each of these practices, we kept track of which towns had it and which ones didn't. And then if you go to our State of LID story map, which is, you can see the URL there. There's lots of URLs in here. So hopefully Emma is capping some of these and put them in the chat for folks. But if not, we can give the presentation afterwards. But next slide, Chet. So we took all that data after we looked at sort of all these 85 towns, and then for each of those 14 practices, you can click on one of those practices. I think this is the map for parking runoff. And then it highlights which towns have regulations that sort of relate to that policy. And so, for example, this is Haddam. You can see that it has it in its zoning regulations on page 21.8, 21.6, and 21.9. There's a link at the bottom to click right into the zoning regulations. So another town can go on here, find out what Haddam is doing, and either take that and put it in their regulations or modify it for their own use. Next slide. So the other big one was the calculating directly connected impervious area. A bunch of our towns, when they saw the permit, actually this sort of went unnoticed, but after the permit became effective, folks started to realize this provision about calculating how much directly connected impervious area you have in your town. And a lot of towns just did not have the data to be able to support a calculation like that. So DEEP funded a new high resolution impervious cover data layer statewide, so that everyone is sort of operating on the same level. And so it's 1 foot resolution, so it's really high resolution, and it looks back to 2012 because of that look back period I mentioned for past projects of LID where you can take credit for. And the data is divided into 3 categories: buildings, roads, and other. Other is driveways, walkways, parking lots. And so the town can take a look at their town and see where their impervious cover is, how much they have in buildings, how much they have in roads, and how much they have in sort of other categories. And they can also look by basin, as we'll see in just a second. And this is available on both our MS4 website and MS4 map, which you can see the URL for there, as well as CT Eco, which is a natural resource-based geospatial data portal that we manage at CLEAR. Next slide. So what folks do is they zoom into their town, they can click on one of those basins. Next slide. And then it pops up information about that basin in terms of how much impervious cover is in that basin, how much of it's in buildings, how much of it's in roads. There's also a provision in there about DOT roads because towns aren't responsible for that, as well as other impervious. And then from that, they take that number. So for this basin, it's 13.82, and they plug it into one of what are called the Southerland equations. The Southerland equations equations that this guy Southerland came up with, I think from the Pacific Northwest or something like that, that are sort of estimates of what directly connected impervious area is based on your percentage of regular impervious cover and the type of land use in that area. So you look at whether you're sort of a primarily urban area and you're fully connected, and then you can use that formula, or you can go all the way down and use one of the other formulas based on what the land use type is in that basin. Next slide. And that will give you an estimate of what your DCIA is. So then once the towns have that, then they have to develop a plan for how they're going to start reducing that, right? And so this has been a big stumbling block for towns to sort of figure out, okay, how do we get to that 2%? 2% sounds small, but you know, how do we do that on a yearly basis, even to sort of look for those retrofits? And so we're working with communities a lot now on sort of helping to figure that out. And some of the guidance that we're providing now is to start looking at in their own house, at their own municipal properties, looking at when they're repaving things or redeveloping things, to focus on, you know, where is most of their impervious cover coming from? Is it mostly coming from parking lots? And if so, then maybe you should focus on those practices that you know, relate to parking lots, because that thing makes things like maintenance easier. If you use the same types of practices over and over again throughout town, it makes that a little bit easier. Your public works folks become more used to using that type of practice. And then beyond that, you know, that's only going to get you so far. For then there has to be strategies for encouraging private action by homeowners or businesses. Next slide. And so Mike talked about this already. This is actually the story map that we have for our virtual tour of campus. Next slide, Chet. That walks through, as Mike said, you can click on any one of these points, and there's a video with Mike doing some talking about that practice. So it's almost like you're out on campus walking around. Perfect for these pandemic times. You don't want to do that. And it gives you more information about that type of practice. And the idea here is this just gives towns examples that they can look at, like how can we visualize what our community would look like using these practices? Well, here's a very urban area on campus where you can sort of get that view. Next slide. So, and then I want to jump into another practice that can be used to sort of get to that idea of incentivizing or encouraging, private homeowners to help you out in terms of reaching this 2% goal, and that's our Rain Garden app. And so our Rain Garden app is an application designed for smartphones that allows anyone to design, size, site, install, and maintain a rain garden. And the idea came from, Mike used to do these rain garden workshops and would give out this very beautiful full color brochure people would then take and, put into a pile on their desk or into a recycling bin eventually or something like that. But and I'm sure they would look through, and some of them used it for the rain garden. But we were thinking about, folks like contractors who may be going out in the field and doing stuff. And one of the tools they always have with them is their smartphone, right? Especially these days. And so we thought, wouldn't it be great if they had how to build a rain garden right there in their phone? And so we released the app. We built it with some students. Actually, some students built it, and we just sort of came up with the design and released it in 2012. First in Connecticut, and then we expanded it to 25 other states. It was going along great for years. A lot of people were using it, and then Android users, for some reason, Google took it out of the Android store a couple of years ago. And so Mike is an Android guy, so he was upset about it. I'm an iPhone guy, so I didn't care that much. I actually did care because Mike was bugging me about it. But so for a while, it was only available for iPhone, which is obnoxious. So we worked with some folks, and we finally released a new version just last month, and it is now available. I'm going to walk through a quick demo of that. Next slide. So the way that the app is structured is it has 5 basic sections. The first one being basics about a rain garden. So that walks you through the what and how of what a rain garden is. And then there's a gallery section that shows you pictures of what rain gardens look like. Whenever you say rain garden to somebody, they always visualize, a garden that has water sitting in it, like a pond or something like that, which is, of course, is not what you want. Next slide. And the next section of the app is the design section, which is really the meat of the app. This is where you walk through, how to pick out a location for a rain garden at your home or business. And there's a video in there with Mike talking about how to do that. There's information on soils. Again, there's a video on how to figure out if the site you've selected drains fast enough to be able to support a rain garden. There's also a soils map that uses NRCS soils data nationally to get a sense of the soils in your area. And then there's a sizing map where you can zoom in to your rooftop or your driveway or your parking lot, click on the corners of it, and it'll tell you how big that area is and how big a rain garden would have to be to treat the runoff from that area. And then one more, Chet. And there's also a sizing calculator, which is not map-based, but you can just put in the width and length or the drainage area if you know that, if it's a more complicated. You can select the state that you want to use for sizing, because different states use different sizes. We have, I think, 25 states sizing in here, and then it will tell you how big the rain garden has to be. You can also customize it for climate change by, if you want to increase the rainfall depth away from whatever the state uses for its default, you can do that. So you can design it for, say, a 5-year or a 10-year or a 50-year storm if you want to. Next slide. The next portion is the plant selector, where you can, there's a little database of plants from all of those states. You can filter by the type of plant, the bloom color, the sun exposure. You can switch the state, you hit search, and it shows you a list of the plants that meet those criteria from that state. And then you can take that to your local nursery and get the plants, and you're on your way. Next slide. There's the install section, of course. Okay, now you have the plants and you know how big it has to be, and you have your design all laid out. And so then you have to figure out how to install. So again, there's a series of videos that show you how to install properly, how to lay out your plants to sort of accommodate the growth of them and things like that. And then most importantly, how to properly maintain your rain garden, both in the short term to make sure that it gets established, but then sort of long term on an annual basis. How often do you have to, what do you have to look for, and what types of things do you have to do? And then finally, next slide, is the My Rain Garden section. And we really built this for those contractors or garden clubs who are putting in a whole bunch of these and they want to keep track of them. And so you can create a little mini database on your phone of all the rain gardens you've installed. Next slide. And as well as the size, location, the plant lists, so you can keep track of that type of stuff and keep track of maintenance on those rain gardens and things like that. Next slide. And so so if you want to get it, you can get it right now. Just go to RG app from any browser on your computer, on your phone, whether it's a Windows phone, if those still exist, an iPhone, an Android phone, any browser. If you just go to rgApp.nemo.uconn.edu, it will be the app right there on your phone, and then you can either bookmark it in your browser, or you can save it to the home screen on your phone or tablet, refer back to it whenever you want to. Next slide. And so for our MS4 communities, this is a great resource because it helps them with several different portions of the permit. It helps them with public outreach and education, right? Because you're teaching folks about the connection between sort of impervious cover and water quality. It helps them with meeting that 2% disconnection goal, because it's starting to help disconnect some rooftops or driveways, that type of thing. And it also supports the LID that they're now requiring in regulation. So if a town is now requiring rain gardens in certain types of developments, and the developer doesn't know what rain gardens are, they can just say, oh, just go download the app and it'll walk you through how to do it properly. Next slide. Okay, and now I'm going to turn it back over to Mike, I believe, to talk about our certification program.
Great, thanks, Dave. So just before COVID, we got a grant from the Long Island Sound Funders Collaborative to basically build a certification type class out of training that we had historically done on rain gardens, bioretention, and other green stormwater infrastructure. So we have been doing these trainings in person for years, and we're really trying to coalesce this around doing some sort of certification to give landscapers, municipal workers, others, something that they can hold on to and say, yes, I've been trained on how to do this. So then COVID hit, and we were not able to do this in person like we wanted to last year. But one of the upsides that's come out of this is, this technology has been here for quite a while, but we hadn't really used it. So we just went ahead and did an online version of this certification class with different modules that are designed for someone to go through at their own pace You know, it's obviously not as good as being in person and being able to have questions answered on the fly, but it's something. So this is the class. We're building it in a Google Classroom platform right now. We just completed it, and I've gotten some feedback from several folks on their how it works for them, and we're getting ready to release it shortly. So just very briefly, Chet, go to the next slide. We set it up just in different modules. So kind of like with the app, how there was an introduction to rain gardens. There's an intro to this whole course. Then there's background on stormwater issues. And in each of these modules, there's a recorded presentation that I narrate, highlighting the key points about it and going through and just talking about it as I would if we were in the classroom. And then there's a quiz for each of those sections internal to that module. And it goes through all the different modules on site selection, plant selection, installation, maintenance, all those different sorts of things. Next slide, Chet. And then at the end, when you're done with viewing all the modules and looking at all the supplementary information, there's a final certification exam. So that takes all of the quiz questions that were built in there and the practice quizzes, puts them together, and you will take this at the end and get a certain score and get a certificate. And we're not sure if it's going to be a certificate or a true certification just yet, but we're figuring that out as we go. But the format is something we hadn't anticipated, but I'm pretty pleased with how it came out. It's been a nice collaboration that we did with the Nature Conservancy folks here in Connecticut. We worked on this with them, and we're pretty excited about that. So it's not going to replace in-person trainings necessarily, but it's something nice to have in the arsenal that we can point people to. There are advantages to being able to go through some of these types of things at your own pace and on your own time. And I think that's it for me. Go ahead, Chet.
Sorry, I just had to kick out of here for a second in order to turn my mic back on. Couldn't reach this, and here we are. Just a couple more slides, folks. Well, this was bound to happen when they give this to the least technically able guy to run the show here. So I hope you can hear me now. Sorry for all that. We're just going to finish up with a project that's about, we're the only academics on this call, a project about using undergraduates to help some of these communities, some of these impervious cover disconnection problems. And it's called the Stormwater Core. It's part of a bigger project called the Environment Core, or E-Core, that's funded by the National Science Foundation, but we're not going to talk about that right now. The way we came up with this is really, we had some colleagues that had done a number of actual surveys and research on why towns weren't doing various things having to do with climate adaptation and with stormwater management, and just found that a lot of our little towns, with that lack of support that we talked about in the very beginning, were just unable to get to these things, not that they didn't want to. So being the brilliant people we are, we thought, well, we've got a lot of really intelligent and highly motivated undergrads at UConn that are looking for real world experience and looking for workforce experience, and maybe we can put those two things together. So we came up with the model. It was originally for a class we call the Climate Core, which is still ongoing. So we have Climate Core, Brownsfields Core, and the third flavor is Stormwater Core. And it's kind of a combination of classroom instruction, service learning, and extension outreach. So it's 2-semester experience. The first semester being in the classroom, and then leading to the students that want to continue on with us to an entire other semester, the practicum or the independent study semester, where we form them up into teams and have them work with towns. The classroom semester we try to make not a typical classroom, so there's a lot of interactivity. COVID has taken a bite out of that, but we've been trying to do as good a job as possible. A lot of exercises, a lot of lectures from the real world, field trips. We do a role play exercise of a town meeting, and they do a final project that's going to lead right into their second semester. And you can see these young ladies on the right are actually making porous concrete. This is something that Mike came up with. And then he actually tests them in the following class to see if there's any tensile strength in that porous concrete. And then the practicum semester. So we form them into teams. They work with real towns. There's really 3 phases to it. They do online scoping using Google Maps and other online mapping tools to look for LID or disconnection opportunities for these communities to get them started. Then they go out with us or sometimes on their own site visit to look at the realities of the sites and some of the things that they've chosen and whether those are really going to work in the real world, and to come up with some recommendations, and also to measure the drainage area of some of these practices that they're going to be recommending to the towns. And then finally, they write a report in PowerPoint format and also report out to the towns on some of the higher quality disconnection opportunities that they found in the town. And that's what the report looks like. They're fairly simple and simple to put together. They have a number of sites that have been visited, and so they use, again, the geospatial technology, or really just Google Maps, to draw some of these practices in terms of the drainage area, and then the practice in green there, which is sized appropriately. And then they do some back of the envelope calculations for each of these sites, having to do with how much stormwater it's going to be taking care of, and perhaps how much nitrogen and phosphorus it's going to be taking out of the stormwater system. And now we have two flavors. We have the academic year core, which I just described, and this summer we're going to be kicking off a summer core where we're going to be paying undergraduate interns to do some of this work as well. And lastly, as I said, they report out to the towns. That's very important, and that's one of the only good things that COVID has ever really done for us or anybody else, is that we seem to get more town officials at our reporting out periods, and have had a lot of first selectmen and mayors attend these things when the students are reporting to the towns. So that's really it. I guess we've gone through fairly efficiently these 5 projects, and we've got 10 minutes left, I think, to take some questions. Emma, I guess I should turn this back over to you. Is that right?
That's a fine picture to land on. Well, thank you everyone so much for the questions you've already submitted, and thanks to all of our presenters for giving us a lot to think about. Our questions so far fall into a couple of different categories, roughly aligned with the categories that we've discussed. So the first one is, this person is familiar with Tmdl goals for phosphorus and for suspended solids, and wanted to hear a little bit more about the metric for this kind of surrogate Tmdl, and kind of what the metric or the goal was for water quality improvements there.
Sure, I didn't go into the detail on that, but it was really based off of that research that had been done nationally and here in Connecticut that found that above 11% impervious cover, you generally don't have good water quality. So the target was 11% or less of directly connected impervious cover in the watershed.
Great. And then the follow-up question to that is, how's water quality? Is the Tmdl working?
That's a great question. That's
not fair to ask. For God's sake.
So that's one of the challenges with this approach. So I think that is a little easier to do with a traditional pollutant like phosphorus or sediment, because it's easier to measure in the water on a regular basis. But we will say, it's easier to track the impervious cover, I think, remotely and keep track of what's going on with projects. But for those, that directly relate to the health of the stream, you can be a little more certain about it with a regular pollutant. We will say that the lower segment of Eagleville Brook has been delisted from the 303D list. So we'd love to we usually actually do claim immediate credit for that delisting as a result of the efforts that have been put in place. But we have not, I have not been able to do the detailed research to truly say that this was the cause of that delisting. Really the only way to test it is to go back out and test for your aquatic life metrics. And so they have to rotate around. They don't have the resources to test every stream every year.
Great. So moving on to the low impact development and low impact design side of things, we had some questions about kind of the specifics of maintenance. So how do you do maintenance to remove the compacted sediments that accumulate in the pervious pavement? And is it something that homeowners can do themselves? You mentioned some equipment needs. How much of a burden is this maintenance?
just like anything, if you are doing it routinely and you start it right away as soon as the product is installed, it's easier. So the machine that UConn has now is more than a regular sweeper. It has more vacuum suction that does a really good job at keeping these pavements fairly clean if they're not too far gone. So if you stay on top of it, this equipment works. It's when they were neglected before that we had to call in the outside contractors that had the really heavy duty equipment that blasts all that sediment out and has, high pressure vacuums and everything. That gets pricey. On a homeowner scale, if you have a very small section of driveway or something like that, it's you pretty much can do it with a shop vac on a routine basis. If you've got a parking lot, that's a different story. Then you're going to need to hire a contractor to take care of that for you.
Great. And then this is a more general question that gets into the specifics of treating stormwater. So once you've infiltrated it, when you talk about treating, this person wants a little bit more detail and also to know about the specific metrics that you use for that.
Yeah, so when I say the gallons of stormwater treated with all of our UConn practices, that means infiltrated. So I've accounted for the general, the amount that a typical stormwater practice will treat given the sizing that's used, which is the 1 inch or water quality volume sizing. So all that's built into my calculation. And if we get a storm that's bigger than that water quality volume, I know that that's not getting treated. So I'm only talking about what gets infiltrated into the ground. We've basically taken it out of the stormwater pipe. That's what that means.
Great. And then I'm trying to figure out from the timing of this question which outreach program they're talking about, but this person wanted to know the approximate cost of the outreach program per year. I think it might have been the municipal one.
Yeah, I think it's probably the MS4 program. And so to get it up and running was much more intensive. So the first year or two of the program, we're now in the 5th year of the program. The first year or two were much more expensive. But now sort of on an ongoing basis, I think it's about $100,000 a year, and it basically covers our extension educator and a little bit of Mike's time and a little bit of my time to go out there and come up with some resources to respond to the towns where they're having trouble and things like that. But yeah, I'd say it's about that now and sort of going forward. But it was a little bit more expensive in the beginning just to set up the website and the maps and things like that.
Yeah.
But the high resolution impervious cover data was very pricey, and we're currently talking to a number of people now to see if there's any ability for us to revisit that and get another updated data layer on that.
Yeah. This one I'm going to read verbatim. Chet, Dave, and Mike, always good to hear from you guys. Do you have salt use concerns on the UConn campus? In Maine, we're finding that chlorides turn the traditional infiltration BMPs ineffective. This is from Don Witherell, but also I know that this is a common concern across not just the Northeast, but everywhere.
It is a big concern. Yeah, thanks, Don. And we are, I've been researching this here on campus for quite a while, collaborating with Gary Robbins, a groundwater guy. Our arguments about groundwater versus surface water pollution led to some great collaborative research projects looking at how some of our pervious pavements impacts the groundwater when salt is applied. But yeah, it's a big concern. Any of our LID stuff doesn't really do anything for salt, but we are working with some others here at our tech transfer office on campus to adapt the Green Snow program that New Hampshire developed. And so we piloted it here at UConn several years ago. We've documented how well it has worked. We've actually been able to show in the water quality in the water quality results in the brook, how well that program worked. And now we're currently adapting that to the state of Connecticut, and it's already been underway for about a year now.
Yeah. So it looks like we have just about 2 more minutes. Oh, and the questions are still coming in. With the context of so many towns operating independently in Connecticut with home rule and in other states that work similarly, have you seen any interest from the towns in working cooperatively and networking to address MS4s, or is it really just working in silos?
Yeah, a little bit of both. They're not quite ready for county government. There's been a bill in the legislature each of the past probably 5 years, pushing for some kind of regional approach to things. I don't think they're quite ready for that. But there are some who, especially on in responding to the MS4 permit, who are sort of banding together. Eastern Connecticut Conservation District, for example, has started somewhat of a stormwater collaborative based on the model that they have in Massachusetts that has worked really well. And I know they've tried that in other parts of New England and the country as well. And so that where they're sort of sharing resources a little bit, and they have purchased some test kits so they can sort of share test kits and things like that. But it's just getting going at this point. I think it could become more likely as towns continue to struggle with various parts of the permit. They'll sort of work a little bit more with their neighbors. But we've also been partnering with our councils of government, which don't have any authority. They're more sort of more of an advisory capacity, and sort of using them to sort of bring towns together and talk about, similar problems and things like that.
I was also just going to add, although this doesn't really have to do with regionalism, but as part of a governor's big multifaceted climate bill that's before the legislature right now, there is finally a part of it that would authorize towns to do stormwater utilities or stormwater authorities, which up until now has been deemed by the lawyers in Connecticut to not really be part of the enabling legislature that gives towns the authority to do so. So we're keeping our fingers crossed on that.
Great. And I'm looking at the time. There's one last one that I want to let you guys give a plug for. How do people find more information about the Green Stormwater course?
So I just replied to Rhonda about that one. So if you send us an email, we will add you to the list when we roll it out. Dave, anything you could say at this point?
No, it's not quite public yet, but yeah, it will be soon. And if you go to, if you wait a few months and go to clear.uconn.edu, we have a training tab that we've just added to the website, and it will be available on that training tab.
Yeah. And it looks like you guys are also looking at the questions. I know that it's 2 o'clock, so if you have to go, I will let you go. But if there's any last questions in there that you want to pull out, I'll let you have a last shot at it. Looks like.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can't actually see the chat box very well. So
well, in that case, there's one more that I'm going to ask, and then I'll let you guys go. Sound good?
Sure.
Perfect. So have any inventories or other prioritization processes been used to identify sites that are having the biggest impact on water quality and where BMPs should be targeted first?
Mike, do you want to talk about it from the campus perspective?
Well, yeah, I don't know if you mean, Rob, if you mean beyond the campus, or are you talking like town-wide level? I'm not sure. I guess there are other places where like we both. Okay. So we manage a nationwide database of where these practices are installed. So we kind of have some sense of where they are. We know we don't have all installations. There are other smaller organizations that do the same. I know there are others that have databases too that have other places that or other practices that we don't even know about. But as far as figuring out where they might have the biggest impact on water quality and where they should be targeted, I know there are some research papers that do stuff like that, like looking at modeling and trying to figure out where would be the best place in a watershed according to a model. But I can't really give you an example of that, something that we've worked on.
Great. Well, with that, thank you all so much. Thank you also to Chet's cat, who has been very a helpful presence. But really, thank you to all 3 of you for sharing all of your expertise. And for all of you who have joined us today, the recording of this will go out in the post-webinar email likely tomorrow. And again, all of our webinars are recorded and announced on our website, which I will also drop in the chat in a moment. So thank you all very much and have a wonderful rest of your week.